And just as I said that, from an abandoned factory next to the graveyard, there was a loud gong.
This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horrors, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Lamont A. Turner about his new collection, Bleeding Out in the Rain. Lamont A. Turner's work has appeared in over 200 venues, including magazines, podcasts, and anthologies. He lives in the swamps outside of New Orleans with his 4 children. Welcome to the show, Lamont.
Hey.
I have an icebreaker question for you.
All righty.
Chicory coffee, yay or boo?
I don't really partake of coffee. Actually, I do work for a company that sells it, and we do sell a lot of chicory, especially out in Mississippi. It's a very popular item.
I love local flavor. So when I was visiting your fair city with my wife, I had some beignets, and of course, as a fan of coffee, I had to try the hometown blend of chicory coffee, and I thought it was disgusting. And when I learned the history of chicory, I found out that it was a bitter root that was used to stain water brown as a coffee substitute during wartime. It has no caffeine, and it tastes awful. So once the blockades were lifted and the wars ended and coffee was allowed back into the various colonies and countries, why people continue to drink chicory coffee is beyond me.
They figured out a way to add the caffeine back into it, and apparently, I guess generation after generation, they acquired a taste for it. But it's pretty popular in some areas, especially down out in the swamp areas.
All right, the less said, the better, I suppose. So, Lamont, tell me a bit about yourself.
Well, I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. I've lived in Louisiana for about 32, 33 years. So I've kind of had, the best of, or the worst of, the heat and the cold. Married, 4 children, 2 cats, a dog, lots of fish, turtle, alligator, all kinds of critters. Nothing else really too interesting, I suppose.
Is the alligator an intentional addition, or did it force its way?
He lives in the swamps. He doesn't live in my house. But he's always in the same spot, and he's been there for years. And I spent a lot of time out there with him. Spent a lot of time in the swamps.
How close are you to the swamps?
It's maybe about a 10-minute drive, in just about any direction. I'm pretty much surrounded by swamps. I've got my pick of which swamp I want to go to.
What's your favorite swamp?
Fido, that's the alligator. He lives out in Bayou Castine. So I spent a lot of time out there. And that's really when I plot a lot of my stories. A lot of my writing isn't actually done in front of the computer. I'll actually, work out the logistics, and come up with the ideas while I'm out there ambling about. That way I can just get right to the difficult typing part and knock it out when I sit down.
Do you have any way to get out on the water? Do you have a boat or a canoe?
They're easy to come by, but mostly I just, walk. I've always been a walker. Even when I was in Cincinnati, I was a kid, it'd be a blizzard out, and I'd wander the streets at night. And sometimes my younger brothers would go with me. I'd tell them stories, and actually some of those stories I later wrote down and put in books.
The one and only swamp boat tour we took was a revelation in how many giant golden orb weaver spiders there were dangling between the trees. Do you encounter those when you're walking?
All over the place. The webs they spin, and they love to spin them across trails. So usually by the time I'm ready to head back to the car, I'm just covered in spider webs, and sometimes spiders.
I can see why you love it so much. So, did you start writing detective stories first or genre fiction first?
There's always been a sort of a mystery element, I suppose, to what I wrote. The first stories I came up with were mostly horror, even before I was writing things down. Just when I was a kid. The detective stories, I love to read detective stories, and they're so much more fun to write. A lot of times, I'll start out and I'll purposely put my characters in a situation that I don't know how they're going to get out of it. That way, it's fun for me to work through it. Whereas the horror stories, I usually have a clear idea of where it's going and what the end is going to be. It's more of a paint by numbers. I've already got it worked out in my head. The mystery stories, I can kind of just go with it. With the mystery stories, I have a character, Doberman, who appears in a lot. And at least for me, after I've written the character so much, he's so much easier to write. I'm already in his head and figuring out how he's going to react. And they're more fun to write.
Have you been able to graft any of your detective story techniques onto your horror fiction?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that most effective fiction has an element of mystery to it. You don't know where it's going to go. There's always that next, something to get you to turn the next page. There should always be that suspense to it that, the characters have to work out. It may not be a straight whodunit, and the characters themselves may not even ever actually reach the conclusion, but the reader will.
How do you define Southern Gothic?
I think the largest component is a certain sense of decay. It's just this idea that things have just run down and been overtaken. This sort of a culture in decline that still persists, sort of a revenant that just sort of clings on even though it shouldn't. And the swamps have kind of reclaimed everything.
Coming from Cincinnati, do you feel like there's a break in between Cincinnati stories and Louisiana stories? Does Southern Gothic influence everything you write, or do you have like some urban stories as opposed to some rural stories?
Oh, definitely. In fact, my Doberman stories are set in Ohio, although I don't know if that comes through as much in the stories. I've written a novel that hasn't been published yet where the setting's a little more important. But, I've definitely written some stories with urban settings, and it's a different feel generally, but I suppose that malaise, that feeling of things slipping away are still there. It still carries over, whether I'm writing about a gangster in New York or Chicago or a crabber out in the swamps.
You have written a lot of Halloween fiction. How does that play in amongst your various Southern Gothic and mystery flavors?
Well, I mean, Halloween is the epitome of all these themes, bagged into one convenient package. You just have the mystery of it, just the idea of being out in your costume, and all the other kids have already gone in, and you're just out there by yourself, with your little bucket of candy. And it's almost like if the stories had their own holiday.
That is such a unique way to phrase it. I like that. Let's get into your new collection, Bleeding Out in the Rain. This has been summarized as a fat slab of weird noir, Twilight Zone twists, and EC Comics horror. It's 400 pages, 38 stories in all. What was your approach to this collection? Did you approach this with a theme in mind?
Actually, it's purposely sort of diverse. Just like my first book, Souls in a Blender, I try to approach it more from the experience of reading a magazine, like an old Weird Tales, where the reader has sort of a potpourri of different experiences. I didn't want to write a 400-page book of short stories, all just, of Civil War stories or, stories about robots or something like that. Something that should please everybody and hopefully not turn off anyone. People will find something in each story they find enjoyable, but sort of more like a ride than just a theme.
I couldn't help but notice that there's a light motif of plagues in the book.
Yes, definitely. Quite a few stories were written during the COVID crisis. I tried to be topical in some cases, but not so topical where it's tied in exclusively to a certain period or event. Sort of like you watch an old Twilight Zone. He's covering things like racism or, the Cold War, but yet it still resonates today because he didn't come out specifically and say, hey, this is about this.
I think the stories are universal, but there are some modern touches. You have people chasing YouTube fame. You have very modern politics in The Deep State is Offline.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Well, see, that's another example. I mean, it was pretty obvious what I was referring to in the story, but it's not really specific. It could apply to some future, well, hopefully not, but some future incident. I have some stories set like in the Old West of the Civil War, and so the modern stories balance that out, I think.
Is there a particular story you'd like to call out amongst the 38 offerings?
Concrete Bimbo, as far as my Doberman mystery stories. I think that one is kind of the epitome of the supernatural Doberman stories. because I do write just straight mystery stories, and some involving that character. And then I write stories where he encounters the supernatural and even science fiction type elements.
So with this recurring detective character who encounters the supernatural, is he changed by his experience with the supernatural? Every time he gets a case to look into some cheating husband, is he like, oh, it might be a werewolf? Or is he like, just grab my camera and sit in the car?
Pretty much the latter. He's really an existentialist. He doesn't particularly believe much in anything, and he just kind of takes it all with a grain of salt. He's one person who's really just not flustered by any of it. One story, actually, I think it was in the novel, he mentions that most people just don't see these things because they don't want to believe it. But he just doesn't care, so he sees it. You know, there's a lot of things that just people just won't accept that he's uniquely fitted to confront because it doesn't challenge his preconceptions of reality because he has none. He goes with the flow.
Nice. Speaking of supernatural inklings, can we talk about some local monsters?
Oh, sure.
You live in Spook Central, New Orleans, but I like to get hyper-local. When I read that you were raised in Cincinnati, I did some digging and I found out about the Waxman of Cincinnati. Have you heard of this figure?
The Waxman? No, I don't think I've heard. The big one when I was a kid was the Loveland Frog.
Loveland Frogman, yeah.
And it was the Mad Albino. But the Waxman, I don't think I came across that one.
It is such a slight story. It reeks of teenage imagination, and I love it. So let me lay it out for you. This character, the Waxman, was reputed to drive every night at the same time to the same junkyard. He drove a golden Buick, and his face looked like it was made of wax or covered in wax. Legend goes that if you try to follow him, he'll always manage to lose you, but you may see him showing up in your rearview mirror or playing tricks on you or trying to scare you off.
Huh.
It doesn't make a lot of sense, nor should it, but that is the general story of the Waxman of Cincinnati.
And as to what he does in this junkyard, nobody is completely certain. Some say that he's a ghost who died in the junkyard, forever doomed to repeat the final moments leading up to his death.
Yeah, I wish I would have known about that when I lived up there. I would have used that to scare the girls with.
Are there any Louisiana favorites now that you're relocated?
You've got the famous ones like the Axeman of New Orleans, the LaLaurie house, all that. The French Quarter is full of horrible murders and ghoulish things. The Honey Island Swamp Monster, the Loup-Garou, the cryptids and the urban legends down here are pretty well documented. But I haven't run into anything too scary out there.
I was considering the Axeman, but that sort of led me down a bloody rabbit hole into the various axe murders around the country during the early 19th century, and it was pretty depressing. I normally don't go into serial killers too often, although it can't really be avoided. Can you talk a bit about the Axeman?
Well, I think he's sort of unique and more of an enduring myth because, like Jack the Ripper, he was never caught. There's always going to be that mystery, that mythic element to him. He's not just like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, some sort of pathetic psycho who murdered people. Nobody will ever really know who this person was or what this thing was, if you really want to, stretch your imagination a bit.
The Axeman of New Orleans would brutally attack people at night in bed in their sleep. And he wrote a letter to a New Orleans newspaper.
Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a fell demon from hottest hell. When I see fit, I shall come again and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with the blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the Angel of Death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 o'clock, earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to the people. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose house a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. One thing is certain, and that is some of those persons who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any. We'll get the axe.
Everyone rushed out to the jazz clubs or struck up jazz bands and played jazz music in their own homes. And there's even a song that came out of this called Don't Scare Me, Papa, something like that. But I will append that song to the end of the episode.
Yeah, kind of a bit of a cheat, for him to ask that. I mean, to play jazz in New Orleans, like that doesn't always go on anyway down in New Orleans.
Maybe he just wanted a night off.
But then he disappeared after that.
It worked. Maybe there was enough jazz music played all at once that he could retire. Do you have any Halloween stories?
I was always the kid who went for the elaborate, sometimes painful costumes. I'd strap, mannequin heads to my shoulder and be a three-headed monster. I remember one year I was a scarecrow and it poured down rain and the mask was just stuck to my face and I couldn't see and I was, falling in driveways and go to parties I couldn't eat because I had this zombie makeup all over my face. I was always that type. Stay in character the whole time. One particular Halloween, friends and I went down by the Little Miami River to the cemetery, and I was telling the story about the mad albino and his ghoulish gremlin-like minions. And I said he summoned them with a gong. And just as I said that, from an abandoned factory next to the graveyard, there was a loud gong. And everybody's tripping over tombstones to get back to the car. And I can't take much credit for it, but, know why it happened, but it worked out pretty well.
Can you catch us up on the Mad Albino?
Kind of like the Waxman that you mentioned, just sort of this vague, not really much of a story to it. He just supposedly haunted the roads along the Little Miami River, looking for a victim. I have no idea what he'd do with him if he caught him, where he came from, but...
And did he have gremlins, or was that your own flourish?
I kind of embellished, a little bit about that. I added some minions to him.
And did you add the gong?
Yes, the gong was mine too.
Master stroke. So you have 4 children. You're surrounded by swampland. What does trick-or-treating look like?
Down here, it could be sweltering or never cold, but it could be cool. You never know what kind of turnout you're going to have. I usually stick around to scare the kids and hand out the candy. I've noticed the past few years it's trended older. One year, I had senior citizens. I thought they were in costumes at first, but no, they were actually just older than I am, just coming up and getting candy. I mean, oodles of them. And I never really figured that one out because the next year it was back to kids again. But
there's a story there.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Maybe they were not quite alive. Can return from the grave for that last Halloween.
Or they have gotten back in touch with their inner children, or it was a way to reclaim their youth, because you said they were back to kids the next year.
Could be. Maybe the children somehow switched bodies with their grandparents accidentally somehow.
Oh, fantastic. I love it. And why shouldn't old people trick-or-treat?
Oh, yeah, they got just as much candy as the kids did.
I love that. So what projects are you working on next?
Just more short stories presently. I keep getting ideas for stories, and I got to write them down. One of the reasons I write primarily short stories is just there's so many stories I want to write. This October, I've got quite a few stories coming out, various magazines. Got one in Schlock, Dark Dossier, Black Petals, Weird Fiction Quarterly. The next one that's coming out from St. Rooster, the publisher of the last 2 books that I did. It's going to be a sequel to Bleeding Out in the Rain.
Excellent. Where can our listeners find you online?
I'm on Twitter at, Lamont A. Turner 1. I've got a Facebook group called The Haunt of Lamont.
We're a couple days away from the autumnal equinox. I hope it finds you well on your swamp walk. Say hello to Fido for us.
I certainly will.
All right, bye, Lamont.
All right, bye, Jeff.
Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.
Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and as it is about time that I have left your homely earth, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed either in fact or the realm of fancy. Signed, the Axeman.